The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It screamed through the Black Hills pines like a ghost with a grudge, tearing at Clara Jennings' thin coat, trying to steal the last of her warmth. Each step was a prayer. Each breath was a knife of ice in her lungs. Her boots sank into the snow, leaving impressions that the storm devoured in seconds, erasing her from the world as fast as she could flee. She clutched her swollen belly, a silent promise to the life kicking within. "I'm still here, Mama. Don't you dare give up." She couldn't give up, because behind her, somewhere in that vast white emptiness, were men. Men hired by Silas Monroe, men who didn't ask questions, they just followed orders, and Silas wanted her back. More than that, he wanted the son she carried. The thought made bile rise in her throat. She'd heard his plan, whispered to one of his hired hands when he thought she was asleep. A plan so cruel it defied God. He'd let the baby be born. Then he'd declare him stillborn. A tragic, quiet death. She would never even get to hold him. They'd bury an empty box while her real son was spirited away, his future decided by the man who had already murdered her husband. Then Silas, the grieving benefactor, would swoop in. He'd offer comfort. He'd offer marriage, a fresh start, a cage built on lies and graves. A branch snapped in the woods nearby. Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She listened, straining against the shriek of the wind. Nothing. No hooves, no voices, just the endless biting cold. She pushed onward, following a game trail that was little more than a whisper in the snow. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stop. The sky was a blanket of oppressive gray, spitting flurries that stuck to her eyelashes and melted on her cheeks like cold tears. Her fingers were numb, her legs were screaming. The baby kicked again, a hard, insistent thump. Keep going. Then, as she crested a small ridge, her boot slipped on something hidden beneath the powder. Ice. The world tilted sideways. She cried out, landing hard on her hip with a sickening crack. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up her side. She slid down a steep bank, a mess of flailing limbs and torn fabric, until she slammed into a frozen log at the edge of a river. Dazed, blinking through a curtain of snow, she saw it, a shape, dark and still, just beneath the river's frozen surface. At first, her mind refused to see it. A log, a shadow. Then she saw the hand, pale fingers curled tight, reaching for something that wasn't there. A man. He was trapped in an icy tomb, and in that moment, she forgot her own pain, her own fear. A voice, her mother's, echoed in her memory, firm and absolute. You don't leave a soul to die alone. Ignoring the fire in her hip, she scrambled down the rest of the bank. The ice groaned and cracked under her weight as she crawled to the edge. There was no one else for miles. No help was coming. There was only her. Her eyes scanned the shoreline, desperate. A thick, broken branch lay half buried in a drift. She seized it, her teeth gritted against a sob of pain and effort. She raised the branch and brought it down on the ice. Crack! The sound was like a gunshot in the silent woods. She struck it again and again. Shards of ice flew into the air. Cold water surged up, black and shocking. She plunged her arms into the freezing water, the cold so intense it felt like burning. Her numb fingers found fabric, then skin as cold as stone. He's dead, a part of her whispered. You're wasting your last strength on a corpse. But she couldn't stop. With a guttural groan, she pulled. He was heavy, a dead weight of soaked wool and frozen limbs. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him from the river's grip. His face was blue. Ice clung to his eyelashes. A dark, ugly gash was matted into his hair, crusted with frozen blood. He was young, maybe her age. She hauled him up the steep, snowy bank, her muscles screaming, her vision blurring at the edges. The world swam in and out of focus. She thought she might pass out right there and doom them both. Then she saw it. Through the trees, a thin line of black against the gray sky. A roof. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. A cabin, old and leaning, half swallowed by snow, but it was shelter. With the last ounce of strength she possessed, Clara Ara dragged the frozen man toward it. The door hung on a single rusty hinge. She shoved it open and collapsed inside, pulling him over the threshold just as darkness finally claimed her. The air inside was stale and colder than a crypt, but it was out of the wind. A small cast-iron stove sat in the corner, a tiny pile of wood next to it, 2 logs, a handful of kindling. It would have to be enough. Clara Ara moved on instinct, her mind a fog of pain and exhaustion. She stripped the man's frozen coat, rubbing his limbs with a desperation that bordered on violence. She laid him as close to the stove as she dared. She fumbled in her skirt pocket. Her late husband, William, had always told her to carry 3 matches wrapped in oilcloth. Bless you, William. The first match sputtered and died. The second caught. She fed the tiny flame into a nest of bark and tinder. It flickered, threatened to go out, then roared to life with a hungry whoosh, warmth, light, hope. She leaned over the man, pressing her ear to his chest. Silence. For a terrible second, she thought she'd done it all for nothing. Dragged a dead man through a blizzard only to die beside him. Then a flicker. A ghost of a movement beneath his ribs. A breath. "Come on," she whispered, her voice a raw, trembling thing. "Stay with me, please." She found a moth-eaten blanket in a dusty chest and draped it over him. Then she curled up on the floor, as close to the fire as she could get, wrapping her arms protectively around her belly. The baby was unnervingly still. She pressed her face to the rough wood of the floor, and finally, she wept. She cried for William, for the home he'd built and the life they'd lost. She cried for her unborn son, for the stranger on the floor, and for the woman she used to be. Outside, the snow fell, blanketing the world in a deep and unforgiving silence. Inside, the fire crackled, a tiny, defiant heartbeat in the heart of the storm. And 3 lives, each one hanging by a thread, fought to keep burning. Morning arrived not with light, but with a change in the silence. The world outside was muffled, buried under a fresh blanket of snow. Inside the cabin, the fire was a bed of glowing embers. The warmth had held. Clara Ara ached in a way that felt bone-deep. She pushed herself up, every muscle protesting. The man was still unconscious, but the deadly blue pallor had left his lips. A faint steam rose from his drying clothes. He was alive, for now. She crawled over and laid a hand on his forehead. It was hot, slick with sweat, fever. His body was fighting. But fighting took energy, and this cabin had almost nothing to give. She looked at the woodpile. 1 log left, not enough to last the day. The cabin was a wreck. A broken window was stuffed with old rags. A rusty hatchet lay under a bench. In a drawer she found twine and a broken clay pipe. No food, no salt, no sign of life for years. But then she saw them, in the thin layer of dust on the floor, near the door. Boot prints. They weren't hers. They weren't the stranger's. They were fresh. Someone had been inside this cabin, and recently. Her heart leaped into her throat. She crept to the door and eased it open a crack. Faint tracks, already half filled with new snow, led away from the cabin and into the tree line. Someone had been here. Maybe they were still out there, watching. She shut the door, her hands trembling, and wedged the hatchet handle under the knob. It was a flimsy lock, but it was something. Around noon, the man groaned. His head rolled to the side. His eyelids fluttered. They opened, glassy and unfocused. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment before his eyes found her. "Where?" His voice was a dry rasp. "You're in a cabin," she said, offering him a tin cup of melted snow. "I pulled you from the river." He tried to sit up, coughed, and fell back with a wince. "Don't," she said, propping his head with the rolled-up blanket. "You have a nasty gash on your head. You nearly froze solid." He drank the water like a man dying of thirst. His eyes scanned the small room, taking in the meager fire, her swollen belly, the hatchet wedged under the door. "Why?" he croaked. "Why help me?" "I couldn't leave you," she said simply. He studied her face, his gaze sharpening slightly. "You're running from someone." It wasn't a question. She didn't answer, just turned and added the last log to the fire. The flames leaped up, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "What's your name?" she asked, changing the subject. He hesitated for just a second too long. "John," he said. His voice was stronger now. "John Smith." It was the most obvious lie she had ever heard. A man with a name like John Smith didn't end up half dead in a frozen river in the middle of nowhere. A man with a name like John Smith didn't have the calloused hands of a fighter or the wary look of a man who slept with one eye open. But she didn't call him on it. In the wilderness, you didn't ask for truths that people weren't ready to give. It was a dangerous currency. "Clara Ara," she replied. An uneasy silence settled between them. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. "Those tracks outside," he said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the door. "They're not yours. I know." "Whoever made them didn't want to be seen," he continued, thinking aloud. "They came to the door, looked in, and left. They know we're here." A cold dread seeped into Clara Ara's bones. Silas was meticulous. He wouldn't send men who left careless tracks. So who was watching them? "We need to move," he said, trying to push himself up again. "You can't even stand," she shot back. "We're not going anywhere until you can walk, and I need to find more wood before we freeze." She grabbed the rusty hatchet, her knuckles white. She was terrified to leave him, terrified to step outside, but they had no choice. As she reached for the door, the man she knew as John Smith spoke again. "The locket," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "Around your neck." She instinctively clutched the small silver oval. It had been William's last gift to her. "What about it?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. My wife had one just like it," he stammered, his eyes filled with a sudden raw pain that looked shockingly real. "Before she died." Clara stared at him. The story was flimsy, but the grief in his eyes felt genuine. Was he telling the truth? Or was he a skilled liar, playing on her sympathy? She didn't know what to believe. All she knew was that she was trapped in a tiny cabin with a mysterious, wounded man, while an unknown watcher lurked in the woods, and a killer hunted her through the snow. She pulled the door open and stepped out into the blinding white, the hatchet feeling pitifully small in her hand. The cold was a physical blow, but the fear was colder. The man who called himself John was a liar. She was sure of it. But the way he'd looked at her locket, it had unsettled her more than the lie about his name. She spent the afternoon gathering wood, never straying too far from the cabin. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind made her jump. The watcher in the woods felt like a tangible presence, a pair of unseen eyes following her every move. When she returned, exhausted and freezing, she found him sitting up, the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He looked stronger, more alert, dangerously so. He had taken the liberty of searching her things. Her small bundle of clothes was disturbed. The heel of cornbread was gone. "I was hungry," he said, without a trace of apology. "You had no right," she snapped, her anger flaring hot and fast. "In a place like this, you take what you need to survive," he countered, his gaze hard. "You should learn that." His eyes flickered again to the locket. "Can I see it?" "No." He sighed, leaning back against the wall. The movement was slow, deliberate, but she could see the strength returning to his limbs. He was healing, and the faster he healed, the more dangerous he became. "You're running from a man," he stated. "A rich man, a powerful man. How would you know that?" "Because only a man like that would drive a pregnant woman into a blizzard." "What did you do? Steal from him?" "He killed my husband," she said, the words tasting like ash. The man's expression didn't change. No shock, no sympathy, just cold, calculating assessment. It was as if he'd been expecting it. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the dying fire, the hatchet in her lap, watching him. He slept, or pretended to, his breathing deep and even, but she felt like a rabbit in a den with a wolf. In the dead of night, she decided she had to know. She crept over to where he lay. His coat was folded beside him. Carefully, silently, she reached into the pockets. Her fingers closed around something small and metal. She pulled it out and held it up to the faint moonlight filtering through the dirty window. It was a cufflink, silver, elegant, and expensive. Engraved on its surface were two initials, SM. Her blood turned to ice. SM Silas Monroe. Her mind reeled. It couldn't be. Silas was clean-shaven, his hair dark. This man had a beard. His hair was lighter, matted with blood and grime. But the build, the height. Had she saved the very monster she was running from? Had she pulled him from the river, nursed him, shared her fire with him, only to put herself and her baby directly into his hands? The gash on his head. Had he fallen? Or had someone else attacked him? A rival? Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She looked at the hatchet in her lap. She could do it. Right now. While he slept. One clean blow. It would be self-defense. She rose, her movements stiff, robotic. She stood over him, the hatchet raised, the faint light glinting off its rusty blade. He stirred. His eyes snapped open. They weren't the cold, cruel eyes of Silas Monroe. They were a different shade of blue, and they were wide with fear. He had been pretending to be asleep. He had been watching her. "Don't," he whispered, holding up a hand. "It's not what you think." "Silas Monroe," she breathed, the name a curse. The man's face twisted, not with malice, but with a deep, profound bitterness. "He's my brother," he said, the words dropping into the silence like stones. "My name is Elias Monroe, and he's the one who left me for dead in that river." The hatchet slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor. Brother. Elias Monroe. The world seemed to tilt on its axis for the second time in as many days. She stared at him, trying to process the impossible truth. The man she'd saved wasn't her enemy. He was her enemy's enemy. "Your brother?" she stammered. "My older brother," Elias confirmed, pushing himself into a sitting position. He didn't look at her, but at the fire, his expression bleak. The heir to everything, the one who gets what he wants, no matter the cost. He finally looked at her, his eyes holding a grim understanding. "He wants you, and the land your husband owned. And he tried to kill me for my share of the inheritance. It seems we have a common problem." Clara sank onto the floor, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture more terrifying than she could have imagined. Silas hadn't just orchestrated William's death. He had tried to eliminate his own brother, too. He was clearing the board of anyone who stood in his way. "The tracks," she whispered. "The boot prints outside." "Not Silas," Elias said, shaking his head. "He wouldn't get his hands dirty. He'd send someone to check, to make sure I was really gone." His eyes narrowed. "Or he sent someone to watch the cabin, knowing you'd eventually seek shelter here. This is an old hunting outpost our family has owned for years." The watcher in the woods. They weren't just being watched. They were being observed by one of Silas's pawns. "We're trapped," Clara said, the reality of their situation crashing down on her. "For now," Elias corrected. He winced as he shifted, the gash on his head clearly still causing him immense pain. "But he doesn't know you found me. He thinks I'm at the bottom of the river. That gives us one advantage. He's looking for a lone, pregnant woman. He's not expecting her to have an ally." An ally. The word hung in the air between them. Could she trust him? He was still a Monroe. He was born of the same family, raised under the same roof as the man who wanted her and her child dead. As if reading her thoughts, he said, "I know you have no reason to believe me, but Silas took everything from me. My birthright, my future. He tried to take my life. I will not let him take yours, too." His gaze fell to the locket still clutched in her hand. "The reason I asked about that, Silas gave one just like it to his fiancée years ago, a woman named Eleanor. He claimed she ran off, but after what he did to me, I'm starting to wonder. Another victim, another life consumed by Silas's greed. Clara Ara opened the locket. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of William, smiling, his eyes kind. On the other side, tucked behind the portrait, was something she'd almost forgotten about. A tiny, folded piece of paper. William had put it there the day he gave it to her, telling her it was a map to his heart. A silly, romantic gesture. She'd never opened it. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the minuscule square. It wasn't a love note. It was a drawing. A crudely sketched map of a small plot of land bordering the massive Monroe Ranch. And on it, a series of numbers and a single cryptic word. Deed. "What is it?" Elias asked, leaning closer. "My husband," she whispered, her voice trembling. He owned a small piece of land, a worthless patch of rock and scrub, he always said. But Silas was desperate to buy it. William always refused. Elias stared at the map, a slow, dawning horror on his face. "That's not worthless land, Clara Ara. That's Scorpion Creek. Our grandfather prospected there decades ago. He always swore there was a major silver vein running right under it. But the claim was lost. The deed vanished." It all made sense. Silas didn't just want her. He didn't just want to control her. He wanted that land. He'd killed William for it, and now her unborn son, William's only heir, was the legal owner. That's why Silas couldn't let the baby live. He needed the child to disappear so he could seize the land, the silver, the fortune it represented. This wasn't just about cruelty. It was about an empire. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked. Not inside the cabin, underneath it. Elias froze, his eyes locking with hers. He put a finger to his lips. The watcher wasn't in the woods anymore. They were right under their feet. A low scraping sound came from below. Someone was in the crawl space. They weren't just being watched. They were being besieged. The scraping stopped. A muffled cough echoed up through the floorboards. They weren't alone. Elias moved with a startling, silent swiftness. He grabbed the rusty hatchet, his previous weakness vanishing in a surge of adrenaline. He gestured for Clara Ara to move to the far corner of the cabin, away from the loose board in the center of the floor that covered the small root cellar. "He knows we're here," Elias mouthed, his face grim. "He's been waiting." Who was it? One of Silas's men? Had they been sent to finish the job Elias's brother had started? The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Clara Ara held her breath, her hand protectively on her belly. The baby was still, as if sensing the danger. Then, a voice drifted up from below. It was old, reedy, and surprisingly calm. "Figured you two might be getting hungry." A moment later, the cellar door pushed open from beneath. An old man emerged, grimy and weathered, with a wiry beard and eyes that had seen too many winters. He held up a brace of rabbits in one hand and a half-full bottle of whiskey in the other. "Name's Jed," he said, hauling himself into the cabin. "Been keeping an eye on this place. And on you." Elias didn't lower the hatchet. "You're one of Silas's men." The old man, Jed, let out a wheezing cackle. "Work for Silas Monroe? I'd sooner kiss a rattlesnake. That man's poison." He tossed the rabbits onto the floor. "I live a few miles down the ridge." Saw the smoke. Figured whoever was in here was either desperate or stupid. Turns out, you're both. He looked from Elias's head wound to Clara Ara's swollen belly. "And you've brought a whole mess of trouble with you." "What do you know about trouble?" Clara Ara asked, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "I know Silas sent 2 men up here yesterday looking for his brother's body," Jed said, his gaze settling on Elias. "And I know he sent another one this morning looking for a runaway woman. They're combing these hills. Sheriff Brody's with them." "Sheriff Brody?" Elias's face darkened. "Brody's on Silas's payroll. He has been for years." Any hope of finding help from the law evaporated. They were completely on their own. "They think you're dead," Jed said to Elias, "and they think she's alone." He took a swig of whiskey. "That's the only reason you're both still breathing. They ain't in a hurry. They think they've got all the time in the world." Why are you helping us? Clara asked, suspicion lacing her tone. Jed's cheerful demeanor faded. He looked down at his gnarled hands. Silas Monroe ran my family off our land 20 years ago, took our water rights, starved us out. My wife, she got sick. We couldn't afford a doctor in town. She died that winter. He looked up, and his eyes were chips of ice. I've been waiting a long time for a chance to hurt that man. And you too? You're the biggest storm cloud he's ever had hanging over his head. I just want to be there when the lightning strikes. He seemed genuine, but in this web of lies and betrayal, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. They're camped at the base of the West Ridge, Jed continued. 4 of them, including the sheriff. They plan to make their move at dawn. They'll sweep the whole area. Dawn. They had less than a day. We can't run, Elias said, thinking fast. Not with Clara Ara's condition, and they know the land. You don't have to run, Jed said, a sly glint in his eye. You just have to be smarter. He pointed to the map in Clara Ara's hand. That deed Silas is after, the real one is hidden. My grandfather was partners with yours, he said to Elias. Old man Monroe stole the claim, forged the papers, and built his fortune on a lie. The real deed, it's tucked away somewhere safe. Where? Elias demanded. In the old prospector's mine, the one that supposedly collapsed 50 years ago. But it didn't collapse. Your grandfather faked the cave-in to protect what was inside. Jed grinned, showing a mouth of missing teeth. Silas knows the legend. He's been searching for that mine for years. He thinks the deed is his key to unlimited wealth. A plan began to form in Elias's mind, desperate and dangerous. He wants the deed, Elias said slowly. So we'll give it to him. He looked at Clara Ara, a silent question in his eyes. It was a wild gamble, a trap that could just as easily snap shut on them. Before she could answer, a sharp, cramping pain shot through her lower back. She gasped, grabbing her belly. The baby. It was too soon. The stress, the cold, the fear, it was all coming to a head. Jed and Elias both looked at her, their expressions turning from strategic to alarmed. How soon? Elias asked, his voice tight. Clara Ara shook her head, tears of pain and panic welling in her eyes. I don't know. Soon. The clock hadn't just run out. It was about to explode. Jed didn't panic. The old trapper had seen more life and death in these hills than most people saw in a lifetime. All right, he said, his voice taking on a new authority. The mine. It's our only chance. It's dry, it's defensible, and they'll never think to look for you there. He looked at Elias. But we gotta move now. The pain subsided, leaving Clara Ara trembling and breathless. I can walk, she said, forcing herself to her feet. She would not be a burden. She would not be the reason they failed. They gathered what little they had, the blanket, the knife, the last of the water. Jed shouldered a heavy pack that seemed to appear from nowhere. Elias took the hatchet, his face a mask of grim determination. I'll lead, Jed said. The path is treacherous, but it's the quickest way. Stay close. They slipped out of the cabin's back window, melting into the pre-dawn gloom. The forest was a maze of shadows and phantom shapes. Every step was a risk. A slip on a patch of ice, a loud snap of a twig, could bring Silas and his men down on them in an instant. Clara Ara moved in a haze of pain. The contractions were coming faster now, sharper. She focused on Elias's back in front of her, planting her feet where he planted his. She bit down on her lip, stifling the groans that threatened to escape. After what felt like an eternity, Jed stopped. He pointed to a sheer rock face, covered in ivy and old snow. We're here. There's nothing there, Elias said. Jed grinned and pulled aside a thick curtain of frozen vines, revealing a dark, narrow opening. That's the point. The air that wafted out was cool and smelled of damp earth and stone. It was the entrance to the old Scorpion Creek mine. They ducked inside, and Jed rolled a large, carefully placed boulder over the entrance from within. It fit the opening like a cork in a bottle. They were plunged into absolute darkness. A match scraped, and Jed lit a greasy lantern. The flickering light revealed a narrow, man-made tunnel, its walls supported by thick, ancient timbers. "They'll never find us in here," Jed said with satisfaction. He led them deeper, through winding passages until they reached a larger cavern. In the center was a crude setup, a fire pit, a stack of dry wood, and several crates. Jed's secret home. "Make her comfortable," Jed ordered, and Elias immediately began laying out blankets. Another contraction hit Clara Ara, this one so powerful it brought her to her knees. She cried out, the sound echoing eerily in the vast, dark space. "It's time!" she gasped, looking at Elias with wide, terrified eyes. "The baby is coming now!" Elias knelt beside her, his face pale in the lantern light. He had faced down his brother, survived a frozen river, and was prepared to fight a posse of hired guns. But this was a different kind of terror. "Jed," he called, his voice strained, "we need water and clean cloth." The old trapper was already moving, pulling supplies from his crates. He'd been preparing for a long siege, but not for this. Outside, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the ridge. Silas Monroe stood beside Sheriff Brody, looking down at the empty cabin. His men had swept the area. The tracks led from the cabin and then vanished into a rocky patch of ground. "She's clever," Silas sneered, a plume of vapor escaping his lips. "But she can't hide forever. A pregnant woman in this terrain? She's either holed up in a cave or she's already dead." "My men will find her," Sheriff Brody assured him, his tone full of false confidence. He was a man who knew which side his bread was buttered on, and Silas Monroe owned the whole bakery. "Find her?" Silas laughed, a cold, empty sound. "Sheriff, I don't just want you to find her. I want you to make sure she has a tragic accident, a slip and fall. The wilderness is so unforgiving after all." He turned and looked out over the vast expanse of his family's land, his eyes glinting with avarice. "And if you happen to find my brother's body," he added casually, "leave it for the wolves. No one needs to know he ever came back." Brody nodded, a sick feeling in his stomach. He was a corrupt lawman, not a cold-blooded killer. But he was in too deep to back out now. Suddenly, one of his deputies came running up the path, his face flushed. "Sheriff, we found something!" He led them to the edge of the rocky clearing where Clarara's tracks had disappeared. He pointed to a small object glittering in the snow. Silas bent down and picked it up. It was a cufflink. Silver, with the initials SM. It was the one he had lost in the struggle with Elias at the river. "He's alive," Silas whispered, his voice dangerously low. He straightened up, his eyes scanning the landscape with a newfound intensity. Elias was alive, and he was with her. This changed everything. This was no longer a simple manhunt. It was a war. "The mine," Silas breathed, his gaze locking onto the sheer rock face in the distance, the one rumored to be collapsed. He knows. He knows about the mine. He turned to Brody, his face a mask of fury. "Forget the woman. I want him. Find that mine entrance. I want Elias Monroe's head on a platter." The hunt was no longer about a frightened woman. It was about two brothers, a hidden fortune, and a final bloody reckoning. The cavern echoed with Clarara's ragged breaths. The world had shrunk to this small bubble of lantern light, to the feeling of Elias's hand gripping hers, and the overwhelming, primal force of her own body. "You're doing it, Clarara," Elias said, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of pain. "You're so strong." Jed worked quietly in the background, boiling water, tearing strips of clean linen he'd kept sealed in a wax-coated crate. He was a strange, grizzled midwife, but his calm presence was a blessing. "One more push," Jed grunted, leaning in. "I see the head. Push now!" Clarara bore down with a strength she didn't know she possessed, a raw, desperate scream tearing from her throat. And then a new sound joined hers, a thin, wailing cry that filled the darkness with the miraculous, defiant sound of life. "It's a boy," Elias breathed, his voice thick with emotion. Jed deftly cleaned the child and wrapped him in a fresh piece of linen before placing the small, squirming bundle into Clara Ara's arms. She looked down at her son, his tiny face red and wrinkled, his eyes squeezed shut. He was perfect. He was safe. Tears of relief and exhaustion streamed down her face. "Samuel," she whispered, giving him the name she and William had chosen. Samuel Jennings. She had done it. Against all odds, in the heart of a mountain, she had brought her son into the world. Elias watched them, a complex mix of awe and sorrow on his face. He saw in her the fierce, protective love he had never known. He saw the future that Silas had tried to steal from them all. The tender moment was shattered by a deep, resonant boom that shook the entire cavern. Dust and pebbles rained down from the ceiling. "What was that?" Clara Ara cried, clutching Samuel tighter. "Dynamite," Jed said, his face grim. "They found the entrance, and they're trying to blow their way in." The gamble had failed. The mine wasn't a sanctuary. It was a tomb. Another explosion, closer this time, rocked the tunnel. A section of the main passage collapsed with a deafening roar. "They've sealed the front entrance," Elias said, grabbing the hatchet. "They're trying to trap us." "Or flush us out another way," Jed countered, pulling a surprisingly well-oiled rifle from one of his crates. "This mine's got more than one way in or out. There's a ventilation shaft that leads to the top of the ridge. It's a tight squeeze, but we can make it." "Go," Elias said to Clara Ara. "Jed will take you and the baby. Get to safety." "What about you?" she asked, her heart seizing with a new fear. "Silas isn't just trying to get in," Elias said, his eyes hard as flint. "He's coming for me, and I'm not going to run anymore. This ends here." He looked at Jed. "Is there another way he'd try to enter?" Jed nodded slowly. "The eastern passage. It opens up behind the waterfall at Scorpion Creek. It's treacherous, but if he knows the old maps, he'll know about it." "That's where I'll meet him," Elias said. He turned to Clara Ara and gently touched Samuel's cheek. "You gave him life. Now let me make sure he gets to live it." He didn't wait for an answer. He took a lantern and disappeared down a dark, branching tunnel, his footsteps echoing until they were swallowed by the immense silence of the mountain. Clara Ara looked at Jed, her eyes pleading. The old man shouldered his rifle. "Don't you worry, girl. He's a Monroe. They're stubborn mules, but he's not his brother. He's fighting for something more than just rock and silver." He helped her to her feet, supporting her as she held her newborn son. "Come on, it's a long climb to the sky." The eastern passage was slick with moisture, the air thick and heavy. Elias moved carefully, the lantern casting huge, dancing shadows on the wet rock walls. He could hear the distant, thundering roar of the waterfall long before he saw it. This was a place of ghosts. The ghost of his grandfather's ambition, his father's disappointment, and his own stolen future. He rounded a final bend and saw it. A curtain of cascading water, shimmering in the sliver of daylight that penetrated the cave opening. And silhouetted against the light, a figure stood waiting. Silas. "I knew you'd come this way, little brother," Silas said, his voice unnaturally calm. He held a modern, pearl-handled revolver, a stark contrast to the ancient, crumbling cavern around them. "You always did prefer the back door." "It's over, Silas," Elias said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "The sheriff might be in your pocket, but Jed has friends in the next county. The truth about what you did to William Jennings, to me, it's going to come out." Silas laughed. "Truth? Truth is written by the man holding the pen, or in this case, the gun." He gestured with the revolver. "Give me the map, Elias, the one the woman was carrying. The original deed is in this mine, we both know it. Give it to me and I'll let you and the little bastard walk away. A new start, my final gift to you." "You've never given a gift in your life," Elias shot back. "You only take." "A pity," Silas sighed. He raised the revolver. "I really did want this to be simple." Meanwhile, high above, Clara Ara and Jed were nearing the top of the ventilation shaft. It was a narrow, vertical climb, using notches cut into the rock as handholds. Clara Ara had Samuel strapped to her chest in a makeshift sling. Every movement was an agony, but the thought of her son's future drove her onward. They emerged into the blinding sunlight at the very peak of the ridge. Below them, they could see Sheriff Brody and his men still working at the sealed main entrance. "They don't know we're out," Jed whispered, pulling her behind a cluster of boulders. He pointed down the far side of the ridge. "My horse is tethered in that thicket. You ride. You ride hard and you don't look back." "I'm not leaving him," Clara Ara said, her voice fierce. "You ain't helping him by getting caught," Jed retorted. "You're his reason for fighting. Now go." He gave her a gentle push. Clara Ara hesitated for a fraction of a second, then ran, stumbling down the rocky slope toward the trees. Jed chambered around in his rifle. He wasn't a young man anymore, but his eyes were still sharp. He settled himself into a sniper's nest among the rocks. The rifle aimed squarely at the back of Sheriff Brody. He was just an old trapper who'd lost everything. He had nothing left to lose. And he was about to make sure Silas Monroe learned the true meaning of that. Back in the watery cavern, Silas and Elias circled each other like wolves. "She's gone, Silas," Elias said, trying to buy time. "You'll never find her." "Oh, I will," Silas sneered. "But first, I'll deal with you." He fired. The shot ricocheted off the wet rock, the sound deafening. Elias dove behind a large stalagmite, the hatchet feeling useless against a firearm. Silas advanced, firing again. A chip of rock flew past Elias's head. He was pinned down, trapped. Then he remembered something Jed had told him. A detail about the mine. "Your grandfather was a clever man. He didn't just build tunnels, he built traps." He looked up. Directly above Silas, a network of old, rotting timbers was wedged against the ceiling, holding back tons of loose rock and debris. It was a deadfall trap, designed for a cave-in. And there was a single, load-bearing support beam right in the center. It was a crazy risk. He'd bring the whole cavern down on both of them. But he was out of options. He waited for Silas to get closer, to step directly under the trap. "It's over, little brother!" Silas yelled, taking aim for the kill shot. At that moment, from high above on the ridge, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the valley. Down below, Sheriff Brody crumpled to the ground, a look of shocked surprise on his face. Jed's single perfect shot had changed the equation. The deputies scattered in confusion, shouting and firing wildly into the rocks. The sound of the shot reached the waterfall cavern. Silas faltered, distracted for just a second. It was the only opening Elias needed. He didn't run. He charged. He threw the hatchet, not at Silas, but at the rotting support beam above him. The blade struck true, sinking deep into the waterlogged wood. There was a groan, a splintering crack, and then the entire ceiling began to give way. Silas looked up, his face a mask of pure terror as tons of rock and earth thundered down upon him. Elias scrambled back, diving through the waterfall just as the cavern behind him collapsed in a final, deafening roar. He emerged, soaked and gasping, into the daylight of Scorpion Creek. Behind him, the waterfall flowed over a solid wall of newly fallen rock. Silas Monroe and his greed were buried forever in the heart of the mountain he'd coveted his entire life. Spring came to the Black Hills, not with a sudden burst, but in quiet, gentle waves. The snow receded, revealing damp earth and the first green shoots of new life. High on a ridge overlooking a valley that shimmered with the promise of lavender, a new cabin stood. It was small but sturdy, built by Elias's hands from timber he'd felled himself. He had built it for her, for them. Clara Ara sat on the porch rocking Samuel, who was now a healthy, gurgling baby. She had found her peace here, a quiet, simple life forged in the crucible of fear and fire. The law from the next county had come, prompted by Jed's testimony. They found Sheriff Brody's body and the scattered, terrified deputies, who were all too willing to confess Silas's crimes to save their own skins. The Monroe Empire, built on lies, crumbled into dust. Elias emerged from the tree line carrying a freshly caught fish. He was different now. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a steady calm. He had found his own peace, not in reclaiming his birthright, but in building something new. He handed the fish to Clara and sat on the step below her. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Their silence was comfortable, filled with a shared history and an unspoken understanding. Jed, the grizzled old trapper who had saved them, became a permanent fixture in their lives. He was Samuel's adopted grandfather, a font of wilderness wisdom and terrible jokes. He'd finally gotten his justice, but he'd also found something he thought he'd lost forever: a family. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the valley, Elias handed Clara a small carved wooden sign. The letters were burned neatly into the wood: Lavender Hollow. It needed a name, he said simply. Tears welled in her eyes. It wasn't just a name for the cabin. It was a name for their new life, a life of healing, growth, and peace. She looked at this man, this brother of the monster who had tried to destroy her. He was nothing like Silas. He had faced the darkness of his own family and chosen the light. He had given her not just safety, but freedom. And in that quiet moment, on the porch of the home they had built from the ashes of their past, she realized she was no longer running from anything. She was finally, truly home. The story of the woman who fled into the blizzard, the brother left for dead, and the fortune buried in a mountain became a local legend, a tale whispered around campfires. But for Clara, Elias, and young Samuel, it was simply the beginning. Their chapter was just getting started, written not in fear and blood, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of a life reclaimed. If you enjoyed this story, a tale of survival, betrayal, and the enduring power of hope, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You never know what other secrets are waiting to be uncovered in the wild places of the world.